How can you make your first chapter the best it can be?
We can help with that. Hello and welcome to the Writing Momentum Podcast. I'm Christopher Maselli, and here with my wife Gena Maselli, and we're here with our good friend Renee Gutteridge. How you doing today, Renee?
I'm good. How about you
Good.
guys?
We're
Doing well. How are you doing,
good.
Gina?
I'm doing really well because it's always fun when we get together with Renee and talk about writing. I feel like I always learn something, and I always feel like it's just fun to get that extra perspective. So,
100%. And I think this is going to be really good though, because we have all between the three of us written a lot of first chapters,
yeah.
right? And they are important because just like the first sentence draws you into the first chapter has to create the entire foundation for your book, right?
Well, and I have a question for you too. How many times how often do you go back and rework your first chapter? And what would you say for a book that you write? How much do you go back and hit that first chapter one more time, one more time, one more time?
I'll let you go first, Renee.
Well, if you're not rewriting your first chapter, are you really writing? It's like,
What would you say, Chris?
I think I always
Do it
almost
brilliantly
I
the
do it
first
brilliantly.
time.
No, I think I keep the meaning of the first chapter, like what I was trying to accomplish with it, but often I'll go back, and that's the chapter that probably gets massaged the most because as you write later chapters, you keep thinking of, oh, but I've got to now set a little bit more foundation for what I'm bringing up in this chapter, and the next chapter, and the next chapter. And so you might start just changing things up just a little bit. Maybe, and sometimes it's just massaging a sentence or two, right? But it's just making sure that everything is set up properly, because if it's not, then it's going to be jolting later on because the reader's going to feel like, where did this come from, right? So you've got to lay that proper foundation.
Yeah, I just had this happen recently. I've been working on a book for a client, and I worked based on some transcripts that I had, and I created the first chapter. And then he and I had a conversation, and that sparked an idea. And so I wrote the first chapter based on what I originally had, sent it to him, and then that sparked a conversation that we had about really more in depth about what he really wanted from the book, which then sparked another thought of a story that kind of, I kept looking for that spark to open the book with, that story that was just gonna be dramatic and kind of set the tone for the whole book. And he had the idea of, well, this happened, and when he had it, it was kind of like, "Well, yeah, I really wanna share about this," and as he's telling me, it was such a dramatic story that I went, "Oh my gosh, yes, let's meet, let's talk about this, let me interview you." That story changed the entire first chapter because it was like the spark that I was looking for the whole to set the whole book off. And so when I went back in, I opened with that scene and with that story, but then that it just brought it all together. So I say that because I started with version 1 and worked on version 1 quite a bit, but still kind of had just that nagging feeling of this, it's not quite there, it's not quite there, but I'm not quite sure that I have the material. And then through more conversation and more interviews, it became I got more information, I got something more dramatic, I got a better opening to the whole book, and that just was so now I don't even know how many revisions I've got on this book.
So
By
so
the time I've
maybe
done it, I mean, because each time where I would get it to a point, that would represent maybe 5 rewrite of getting it to the right place, and I say rewrites, not always super deep rewrites, but where I would try to, "Okay, is this explaining it enough? Is that explaining
so
enough?"
so
So
so maybe the lesson is you have to be willing to do a little bit of sacrificing after the first chapter. What do you think, Renee?
yeah, cut your darlings, as we say sometimes, because they don't matter anymore. Even that really, really great sentence, sometimes you sit down and write a sentence, you're like, it's amazing. You go read it to your spouse or whatever. But Yeah, like, I mean, I think there's a rewrite coming always. There should be, unless you're just super brilliant and nailing it all the time like Chris. And but as I write a full book, I have my notes that they're always filled with set this up, make sure this is clear, do
Mhm.
this, do this. All of that is going, as I write. And now most of that is at least in Act 1, if not in the first chapter. Mhm.
So are you always kind of keeping an inventory of w what you've done as you write future chapters so that you're able to make sure that, "Okay, I'm on chapter 8, but I kinda remember in chapter 1, here's how I set it up, and so I need to go back and edit something there." Do you make a note about that? I mean, you're so in other words, you're kinda keeping it in your mind, that first chapter in your mind the whole time you're writing your book.
Yeah, I mean, unbelievably, in my 20s, I didn't take notes, but, that changes as you drift into your 30s, and, but yeah, that inventory for sure, like, I know I haven't set things up right. I think I have, in the moment I have, but as I'm adding and working through my story, then the first chapter just does not work well. It's probably there's more rewriting in the first half of the book than the second half of the book, almost always, because it is all about adjusting and reworking and making sure everything is set up well. And in that first chapter, we're our job, I mean, at the end of the day, which is grab the reader, make it interesting.
Mhm.
Uh,
We called that a handshake, a firm handshake, right?
Yeah.
Right. And the second part of that, the first chapter, is the actual coffee that you're sitting down with, right? And I mean, it's like, in the usually first few minutes of having coffee with somebody that you haven't met before, whether this is you're gonna, slog your way through this conversation, or you're gonna all of a sudden look up and 45 minutes is gone and
Right.
you're really hoping for that next coffee. And so that's really what the first chapter it should be. But it's doing all kinds of work that your reader will not be aware of in the moment.
Mhm.
It's all behind the curtain kind of work that they're just reading along, going, "Oh, this seems like it's going to be fun. I'm enjoying this copy." And in the back of behind the curtain, you're acting as the salesman. You're thinking, okay, how can I sell that second chapter? How can I get them invested? How can I do this? And so, it's a lot of the smoke and mirrors that the reader's unaware of that you're working out. You're setting things up that are going to be important in the eighth chapter, ninth chapter. They have no idea that you've mentioned a candlestick, but you've mentioned it in an entertaining way, so that they have no idea that, oh my gosh, this candlestick is going to be so interesting later on. It's going to matter to the whole story. You're setting the tone, obviously, for your book. You're introducing the character as somebody who you want to spend time with that's interesting. You're creating the setting. I mean, there couldn't be more plates to spin when you're writing the first chapter. And that is why it almost always should be rewritten, because those plates are going to you're spinning so many, you don't even know some of them have fallen off and crashed and aren't there. But once you get to the rewrite, then, that's really the second draft of that first chapter after the book is finished is where all the magic happens. And it's where you start to look brilliant, and your reader's just thinking, that is just amazing that
How did
that
they
came.
do that?
Go how do they do that, And we all know that it's almost always you're working backwards. You work
Mhm.
backwards and set things up, because you people often say to me, "I didn't even see that coming," and I'm like, "I didn't either. I know you didn't because I didn't see it coming." That's how we work, but it's okay to let people think you're super brilliant in the moment, and you've had all this in your head, and you just sort of speak to the screen, and it types itself out.
It's funny, it seems like when we were talking about first sentences, that fiction and nonfiction books maybe had a different reason for that first sentence to be strong, right? For a fiction book, it's, are you going to entertain me? For a nonfiction book, it is, why should I read this? Right? It seemed to be a different reason that a different something that first sentence had to accomplish. But as you're talking about everything you just said, it seems like it's kind of the same between a fiction and nonfiction book as far as establishing the foundation, getting the buy-in from the reader, and keeping them reading from that point forward. Would you say that's true, Gina?
I would say for nonfiction, for the first sentence or for the first chapter, you have to there's still an element of entertainment there. There still
Mhm.
needs to be an element of entertainment, and there needs to be that trust that's built, which is I think what you're talking about, and setting the vision of where we're going, which I think is important in the nonfiction. But in the fiction, I wanted to kind of tick these off as we're talking. So in the fiction, it needs to be entertaining. We need to introduce our characters, and tell me about that. How would someone introduce a character in fiction in that first chapter? What do they need to know about that character? Because they don't necessarily need to know all the backstory of that character, do they? Or do they?
Right. Yeah. No, you're exactly right. And the very most important thing to remember, and I'm seeing this slide a lot in a lot of the fiction that I'm reading. So I think we keep thinking, in order to hold the reader's attention, I have to just jump into the action, just what's big that's happening, and here we are. I think that is really a mistake. Act one has to be established. Act two does not matter unless Act one is established. And what Act one is, and what you're doing in the first chapter, first three chapters, is you're introducing the ordinary world uh, before their world changes. If we don't know who they were when, the world is ending, or the cute guy comes into town, or whatever the genre is, if we don't know that world, then the second world won't matter. The first Act one is all about, it can be really done in one chapter or three, whatever, but is really about establishing who this person is or who these people are in their world before their world is turned upside down.
Mm.
And the challenge of it in character is to make sure that that character seems interesting enough as a person, that when the inciting action happens or the inciting incident happens, we are like, "Well, I gotta go with this person on this." Like, this person feels like somebody I wanna, I thought we were just having a simple coffee, but my gosh, the world's ending. And you're so invested in this person. And so there should be, a lot of introduction to who they are on the inside and what they do on the outside, the setting, the job, whatever is appropriate for your story. Is he, a cop that's in the middle of solving a murder, or they've, we introduce them in the ordinary world of, they've just, been put on probation because they did this. This is where we find them. It's sort of this is where we found them moment. And so that's why backstory really isn't that important in the first chapter. It's really about who they are and where they are in this moment. And when we read a novel, we know, well, that's not going to change, or that's not going to stay the same, because, we know something's going to happen. If something doesn't happen, then you've got a real problem in your fiction. And so it's really important to establish the voice of the character there through inner monologue, that, we know who they are from the outside and from the inside. It's not just a baker, but it's a baker, whose husband's just died, and they're still in the second stage of grief or whatever, and you pinpoint who they are and where they are in the world right at that moment. And that's where you introduce them. You don't start the novel with inciting incident, or we won't care about the character.
Wow, that's really good.
That's really good.
Wow, that gives me give me some things to think about with the own things that I'm working on too.
Well, and I think you're right, Renee, that the current school of thought is that we've got to throw them right into the action right away. But you're also, that's where we are currently. But I think that's so true that if we don't know there before, then we're not going to understand how devastating or how transformative that inciting incident is if we don't know what it is beforehand. You know, if you don't know that, you know, it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood and then there's a tornado coming, you may not care that the neighborhood gets blown away. You know, you may not. You've got to care. You've got to somehow connect with the characters and their world beforehand.
Hey, you know what? If you're listening to this and you're like, wow, you all are blowing my mind, and I'm just trying to get past that first chapter, and it's so difficult. You know, the whole reason we record this podcast and we have a Writing Momentum membership is because we don't believe that this writing life is not something you have to navigate alone. This is something that we do together. It's not a solitary venture. It's something that you write your material, and then you get people to help you with the editing and help you with the accountability of getting that writing done. And that's why we have this podcast. It's why we have our Writing Momentum membership. You can find out at writingmomentum.com. It's only $25 a month, and we get together all the time, every single week, and we write together. We write on our individual projects together, and it's a way that we can just get that stuff done.
And we support one another.
Yeah.
We ask questions. I think it's a beautiful thing when we can come together in those groups and in those in that writing time. And we always start with 15 minutes of training, but some of those trainings are just question and answers where we talk about it. And then, of course, we've got critiques, which have recently started in the last couple of months. It's the first page critiques, as well as roundtables where we really dive into deeper issues and deeper elements of the writing craft, which work for nonfiction or fiction. So it's important, and it's I think it's very comprehensive in how it hopefully supports the writing community.
Absolutely. So check that all out at writingmomentum.com. Renee, what can you leave us, one tidbit to leave us with for the first chapter?
Well, I would say just make yourself an interesting coffee date. You know, just it's so important to be interesting. That's why you're there. That's your voice. That's your writing style. That's your story idea. You know, all that's coming into that first chapter. So you don't have to be an interesting person. You know, I'm I'm not that interesting off the page.
That's not
That's
true.
so not true.
Well, it can be, you know, I'm never the star of the party ever. But what I am doing is sitting in a corner watching the star of the party and watching the interesting people. They have no idea they're interesting, but
And carefully documenting everything in your mind so that you can use it in a
I
future
am.
novel.
I'm just I'm just like, man, that person is really fascinating to me. And they have no idea. They're just being themselves. And that's what you want to do is just create that interest and this amazing world that just comes off the page. And if you can do that, you'll always get your readers invested into your book.
Well said. Well said. Well, this is not something, as I said, that we do alone. It's not a solitary venture. Come write with Renee, come write with Gena, come write with me, and I think you'll find it fun. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoyed this podcast, tell you one way that you can give back if you like this kind of thing is to leave us a review on the podcasting platform or on YouTube, or leave a comment. Do something that gives back to the community, because that helps other people find this material too. Because we're not in this all alone. Together.
We have writing momentum.
Bye-bye.